3 days after I inherited my uncle's ranch, a stranger stepped onto my porch and told me I owed a homeowners association $120,000. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't explain how the number existed. He simply gave me a deadline and a warning that if I didn't pay, they would take the land. That was the moment I realized something important. They hadn't chosen the wrong property. They had chosen the wrong person to threaten. It was early morning, the kind that only exists far away from cities. The sun had barely risen above the trees, stretching long golden shadows across the gravel driveway. The air carried the smell of pine and dust, and the only sounds came from birds arguing somewhere in the distance. I stood on the porch holding a mug of strong black coffee. Steam curled slowly upward while I enjoyed something I hadn't felt in years: stillness. I had moved into the ranch only 3 days earlier. 3 days. The house still carried my uncle's presence. The scent of aged wood and freshly brewed coffee lingered in the walls like a memory that refused to fade. Nothing about the place was modern or polished. Everything was practical, built with patience and purpose. This land had existed long before developers started carving nature into neighborhoods and attaching polished marketing names to them. That was when I heard footsteps against the wooden porch. I expected to see a delivery driver or maybe a curious neighbor introducing themselves. Instead, a man stood there I had never seen before. He looked to be in his mid-50s. His face was sunburned in a way that suggested golf courses rather than ranch work. His shirt was tucked neatly into khaki pants that looked completely out of place surrounded by pasture land and dirt roads. Under his arm rested a thick binder, clutched like it gave him authority. He never greeted me, never asked if I was the homeowner. He opened the binder, flipped through several pages, and looked directly at me. "You are the new property owner?" he asked. I nodded cautiously. "I inherited it from my uncle." He tapped the binder with one finger. "Then you've also inherited 12 years of unpaid HOA fees. Including penalties and accumulated interest, the total comes to $120,000. For a moment, I laughed. Not because it was amusing, but because my brain refused to process the words. "I'm sorry," I said slowly. "Did you just say homeowners association?" He nodded calmly, already turning another page like he'd delivered this speech many times before. "Spring Valley Homeowners Association. This property falls within our jurisdiction." The mug nearly slipped from my hand. My uncle had never once mentioned an HOA. Not a single time. And he was the kind of man who reminded people if they owed him $20 from 10 years ago. I glanced past the man toward the property. Wide open fields stretched across acres of pasture. Pine trees lined the far ridge. A dirt road ran through the property, untouched by pavement or decorative stonework. There were no gates, no signs, no clubhouse, no manicured lawns. Nothing that suggested neighborhood management or community regulation. "I don't believe this property is part of any association," I said carefully. His jaw tightened slightly. "Our records indicate otherwise," he replied. "If payment isn't received within 30 days, the association will place a lien on the property." There it was. The threat was delivered with professional calm. He snapped the binder closed, handed me a single printed sheet, then walked back toward a black SUV parked near the road. On the driver's side door sat a small logo, Spring Valley HOA. He drove away without another word. I remained on the porch long after the vehicle disappeared. The paper trembled slightly in my hand. The morning was still beautiful. The birds hadn't stopped singing. The land looked exactly the same. But something inside the silence had shifted. At the time, I didn't know the man was the president of the entire homeowners association. And I definitely didn't understand how far they were willing to push. All I knew was this. Whatever game he was playing, it wasn't an accident. And I wasn't about to surrender my uncle's ranch without questioning every inch of it. To understand why this mattered so deeply, you have to understand who I was before the ranch, and who my uncle had been his entire life. My name is Jack Carter. I'm 34 years old. Before all of this happened, my life was painfully ordinary. I worked as a high school science teacher in Houston. My evenings were spent grading assignments and preparing lesson plans. My mornings were filled with traffic and caffeine strong enough to wake the dead. I wasn't wealthy. I wasn't influential. I certainly wasn't searching for legal battles or land disputes. Those things happened to people in news articles, not people like me. My uncle, Mike Carter, was my mother's older brother. He never married, never had children, and he preferred it that way. He wasn't unfriendly. just independent. He believed a person needed very little to live peacefully, land beneath their feet, and quiet at the end of each day. When I was young, I spent every summer at his ranch. He taught me to ride a horse before I learned how to operate a car. He showed me how to repair fencing, predict storms, and listen to the sounds of nature like they were conversations. He never lectured or delivered life lessons in speeches. He simply demonstrated them. The ranch was his entire life. He purchased the property decades ago when land in that area was considered worthless because it sat too far from town. He built the barn himself, cutting timber, hammering boards, digging fence posts by hand. Every structure carried a story, even if only he remembered it. He used to tell me something that stayed with me long after childhood. People don't own land the way they think they do. The land owns you. You're just responsible for taking care of it while you're lucky enough to stand on it. When he passed away, I was shocked to learn he had left the ranch to me. I never expected it. I would have been grateful just to visit occasionally. But his will was clear. Carter's Edge, the name he had carved into the wooden archway at the entrance, was now mine. So I made a decision that surprised even me. I resigned from my teaching job, sold my small city condo, packed everything into a rental truck. Then I drove north with my dog sitting beside me like he understood we were leaving one life behind for another. The first week living on the ranch felt like stepping into a forgotten chapter of time. There were no sirens, no neighbors peering over fences, no constant background noise of city life, only wind moving through trees and the quiet creaking of the farmhouse settling at night. The driveway stretched nearly half a mile from the main road, framed by a simple wooden arch reading Carter's Edge. There were no security gates, no welcome signs, no HOA rulebook taped to the door. And that detail mattered more than I realized at the time. Because if the ranch had ever been part of a homeowners association, there would have been evidence. There are always signs, letters, notices, meetings, rules posted somewhere. But there had been nothing. Standing on the porch holding that threat notice, I replayed every conversation I had ever had with my uncle. He had warned me about droughts, harsh winters, developers offering money that sounded too good to refuse. But he had never once mentioned an HOA. And my uncle was not a forgetful man. That realization planted the first real suspicion in my mind. Maybe this wasn't about unpaid fees. Maybe someone had been waiting for him to die. That night, sleep refused to come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that binder resting under the stranger's arm like a weapon disguised as paperwork. His calm voice echoed in my memory, steady and confident, like the outcome had already been decided. By morning, the quiet no longer felt peaceful. It felt watched. I sat at the kitchen table examining the notice he left behind. At the top sat a sleek, modern logo that looked strangely out of place against the rustic surroundings. Spring Valley Homeowners Association. Below it was a detailed breakdown of charges, annual dues, late fees, penalties, interest. Every number stacked carefully until it reached the impossible total. At the bottom was a sentence written in bold print. Payment required within 30 days to prevent enforcement action. That word enforcement felt heavy. If this was truly a mistake, it would collapse the moment someone examined the facts. Mistakes usually do. So later that morning, I drove into town and followed the address printed on the notice. The HOA office sat inside a glass-front building squeezed between a real estate agency and a nail salon. Fresh paint covered the walls. The interior looked sterile and temporary, like it had been assembled quickly for business rather than community. The man from my porch was already there. "Mr. Carter," he said, standing as I entered. "I expected you would visit. I need to understand how my uncle's ranch became part of your association," I said. He gestured for me to sit, then opened his binder again. Tabs were neatly organized and color-coded, as if prepared for my arrival. "According to our documentation," he said calmly, "your uncle's property was incorporated during the Spring Valley Expansion Initiative." "Approved by who?" I asked. Instead of answering directly, he slid a printed map across the desk. The boundaries were drawn with sharp precision. And right there, inside the newly outlined borders, sat Carter's Edge. "This reflects the association's current jurisdiction," he explained. I studied the map closely. Something felt wrong. The ink looked new. Too new. "When was this expansion approved?" I asked. He leaned back slightly. "The HOA revised its charter last year," he said. Certain properties were reevaluated under updated zoning considerations. That's not how zoning works, I replied. He didn't argue. These changes are currently pending final county confirmation, he said smoothly. However, we are fully authorized to begin compliance procedures. Pending. That word stuck with me. In science, you don't publish conclusions based on incomplete evidence. You don't enforce theories as facts. And you certainly don't demand $120,000 based on boundaries still under review. Unless you were relying on intimidation. I slid the map back toward him. So you're telling me, I said carefully, that you're charging fees based on boundaries that haven't even been finalized yet? His smile didn't disappear, but it became thinner, more controlled. The association is acting within its legal interpretation of jurisdiction, he said. Property owners are expected to comply during transitional phases. That sounds like you're collecting money for land you might not even control. He folded his hands together, resting them on the desk as if patience itself were a performance. Mr. Carter, he said calmly, I understand inheritance situations can feel overwhelming. Many new property owners prefer to resolve these matters quickly so they can focus on settling into their new lives. The implication wasn't subtle. Pay quietly. Avoid trouble. I leaned forward slightly. My uncle owned that land for over 30 years. He never paid your association a single dollar. His eyes flickered for a split second. It was quick, but I saw it. Previous administrative oversights occasionally occur, he said smoothly. The association is simply correcting the record. Correcting the record. The phrase felt rehearsed. And if I don't pay? I asked. He opened the binder again and turned it so I could see the printed legal language. The association will initiate lien proceedings, he said. Eventually, foreclosure becomes a possibility. There it was again. Calm. Professional. Final. I stared at the document, letting the weight of it settle in. He expected fear. Expected hesitation. Expected negotiation. Instead, I stood. I'm going to review county zoning records and property deeds, I said. His posture straightened slightly. You're welcome to pursue independent verification, he replied. But I encourage you to remain mindful of your deadline. 30 days, I said. Yes. I turned toward the door, then paused. One more thing, I added, glancing back at him. What's your name? Richard Halverson, he said. I nodded once, memorizing it. Good, I replied. Because if this turns out to be fraudulent, I want to make sure I know who delivered the paperwork. For the first time, the calm cracked just a little. The county records office sat inside a faded brick building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the late 1980s. The fluorescent lighting buzzed overhead, while rows of filing cabinets stretched across the room like steel walls filled with history. Behind the front desk sat a woman in her 60s wearing reading glasses attached to a chain around her neck. She looked up as I approached, studying me over the top of her paperwork. Help you with something? She asked. I need property zoning and boundary records for Carter's Edge Ranch, I said, and any documentation related to Spring Valley expansion. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. That's a big request, she said. Are you planning to buy or sell? Inheriting, I replied. That answer seemed to soften her expression. She motioned toward a waiting table. Give me a few minutes, she said, disappearing into the archive room. I sat down, my fingers tapping against the wood while my mind replayed every word Richard Halverson had spoken. Something about his confidence bothered me. Not because he believed he was right. Because he believed I wouldn't challenge him. Nearly 20 minutes later, the woman returned carrying several folders stacked under one arm. She placed them on the table with a soft thud. Your uncle kept excellent records, she said, adjusting her glasses. Most long-term landowners don't. That sounded exactly like him. I opened the first folder, scanning the original property deed. It was older, printed on thick paper with ink that had faded slightly with time. The boundaries were clearly defined, signed, stamped, and recorded decades earlier. There was no mention of any homeowners association. I flipped to zoning confirmations, land surveys, agricultural tax filings. Every document supported the same conclusion. Carter's Edge existed independently. Do you have anything showing Spring Valley including this property? I asked. She frowned slightly. I can check, she said. Another trip into the archive room followed. This time, when she returned, she carried a much thinner folder. She opened it slowly, scanning through recent zoning proposals and development planning submissions. Then she paused. Well, that's interesting, she muttered. What? I asked. She turned the folder so I could see it. Spring Valley expansion proposal. The boundary lines included my uncle's ranch, but the approval section remained blank. No county authorization stamp. No finalized zoning confirmation. Just a pending review notation dated 8 months earlier. This hasn't been approved, I said. No, she agreed. And until it is, it has no enforcement authority. My chest tightened slightly as confirmation settled into place. So legally, I said, choosing my words carefully, they can't charge fees or place liens? She shook her head. They can propose inclusion, she said. But enforcement requires finalized zoning acceptance and property owner notification procedures. Both appear incomplete here. I leaned back in the chair, absorbing that information. Relief came first. Then something colder followed behind it. If they knew the expansion wasn't approved, why were they demanding payment? I thanked her and gathered copies of every document she allowed me to duplicate. By the time I stepped outside, afternoon sunlight stretched across the parking lot, but my mind felt heavier than it had that morning. This wasn't confusion. It was pressure. Organized, confident, and deliberate pressure. That night, I spread the documents across my uncle's dining table. The farmhouse smelled faintly of old pine and dust stirred from open drawers and cabinets. The overhead light cast long shadows across the paperwork, making each page look more dramatic than it probably was. My dog rested near the fireplace, occasionally glancing up as I shifted through the stacks. Every record confirmed the same thing. The HOA had no legal authority over Carter's Edge, but that didn't mean they would stop trying. And experience had taught me something about organizations that push beyond their authority. They usually rely on people giving up before the truth surfaces. Around 10 o'clock, I found something unexpected. Hidden inside one of my uncle's filing cabinets sat a leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, edges softened by years of handling. Inside, his handwriting filled page after page, notes about livestock, weather patterns, equipment repairs, and occasionally personal thoughts scattered between daily ranch entries. I flipped through casually at first. Then one entry caught my attention. It was dated roughly 11 months before his death. Developer representatives came again today. Offer purchase price nearly double market value. Refused. They mentioned community expansion plans. It felt strange. Too persistent. My heart began beating faster as I continued reading. Another entry followed 2 months later. Received letter referencing Association Planning Committee. Never agreed to join anything. A lawyer friend says to ignore until formal zoning change occurs. Feels like they're testing boundaries. Testing boundaries. That phrase sat heavy in my chest. The final relevant entry appeared 3 months before he passed away. The same representative returned. Different tone this time. Less friendly. Suggested resistance to development might create administrative complications. I told him the land stays in the family. I closed the journal slowly. My uncle hadn't been confused. He had been targeted. The realization settled over the house like a storm cloud forming without wind. This wasn't about correcting records. This was about acquisition. And if my uncle had lived longer, they probably would have continued pressuring him the same way they were now pressuring me. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the farmhouse made me sit up. Every passing car on the distant road pulled my attention toward the windows. By morning, exhaustion mixed with determination in a way that made my thoughts sharp and focused. I wasn't dealing with a paperwork mistake. I was dealing with someone trying to force me off inherited land through intimidation disguised as bureaucracy. And if that was true, I needed help far beyond county record confirmation. The next morning, I made a phone call I hadn't planned to make. Hello, a familiar voice answered. Claire, I said. I need legal advice. There was a brief pause on the other end. You quit your teaching job, moved to a ranch, and now you're calling me for legal advice, she said. I'm guessing this isn't about livestock permits. Claire Reynolds had been one of my closest friends since college. She specialized in property and contract law, which made her the exact person I needed in a situation like this. I think someone is trying to take my land through an HOA that doesn't legally control it, I said. Another pause. That sounds complicated, she admitted. And expensive. Send me everything you have. I will, I said. But there's something else. What? I think they were pressuring my uncle before he died. Her tone shifted immediately. Jack, she said carefully. That moves this from property dispute into potential fraud and coercion territory. You need to document everything. I already started. Good, she said. Email me the records. And don't respond to any new HOA communication until I review it. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Okay. As I ended the call, I glanced out the kitchen window toward the open field stretching across Carter's Edge. The land looked peaceful, untouched, exactly the way my uncle had loved it. But for the first time since arriving, I realized peace can be temporary when someone else sees profit where you see home. Claire called me back later that afternoon. That alone told me something was wrong. She was thorough to a fault. Normally, she would spend at least a full day reviewing legal documents before offering opinions. The fact that she responded within hours meant she had found something that couldn't wait. I went through everything you sent, she said without small talk. And Jack, this situation is not normal. I leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the property through the window. I figured as much. The expansion proposal they're referencing isn't legally enforceable, she continued. They cannot charge dues. They cannot place a lien. And they definitely cannot threaten foreclosure. So they're bluffing. Not exactly, she said. This feels more strategic than that. I frowned. Explain. They're applying pressure early, she said. If they convince you to pay even a portion of those fees, it could be interpreted as voluntary compliance. That creates a legal foothold for them later. The words sank in slowly. They want me to acknowledge authority that doesn't exist yet. Exactly. I rubbed my forehead, tension building behind my eyes. And if I refuse? Then they escalate, she said. They rely on intimidation, paperwork, and legal fatigue. Most property owners settle because fighting costs time and money. I glanced toward my uncle's journal, still sitting on the table. They tried the same thing with him, I said quietly. There was a pause. I was afraid you'd say that, Claire replied. 2 days passed without any new communication from the HOA. At first, the silence felt reassuring. Then it began to feel deliberate. Late on the third afternoon, a white envelope appeared inside my mailbox. No stamp, no postal markings. Just my name typed neatly across the front. My stomach tightened before I even opened it. Inside was another notice. More formal, more aggressive. Failure to respond to outstanding balance may result in enforcement review and legal action. Below it sat a list of community compliance concerns. Unauthorized fencing. Agricultural structures not meeting aesthetic standards. Unregistered livestock housing. I stared at the paper in disbelief. The barn my uncle built 40 years ago was now considered a compliance issue. It would have been almost laughable if it wasn't so transparent. They weren't just demanding money anymore. They were building a paper trail of violations. I called Claire immediately. They've moved into compliance citations, I said, reading through the list. Her tone sharpened. That's escalation, she said. They're trying to create multiple angles of pressure. It's intimidation through administrative overload. So what do? Document everything, she said. And do not respond emotionally. They want you frustrated enough to make mistakes. I nodded slowly. Claire, I said, how often do organizations push this hard without legal backing? She hesitated before answering. Usually when there's something extremely valuable they want, she said. My gaze drifted toward the open pasture again. The land itself didn't look valuable in the traditional sense. No luxury homes. No scenic lakes. Just rolling fields and tree lines stretching toward the horizon. But developers didn't see land the same way landowners did. They saw potential subdivisions, profit margins, expansion corridors. That evening, I drove to the far edge of the property where the fence line met the ridge overlooking the valley. The sun was setting, casting deep orange light across the hills while wind moved through tall grass and slow waves. My uncle used to stand in that exact spot during storms. He said you could watch the weather arrive before it reached you. Standing there now, I realized something felt familiar. Not peace. The warning. The following morning, I noticed fresh tire tracks near the main dirt road entrance to the ranch. They weren't mine. The pattern suggested a heavier vehicle had pulled in, turned around, and left again. I followed the tracks until they disappeared into gravel near the entrance arch. Someone had been watching the property. I installed security cameras that afternoon. Not because I expected immediate danger, but because uncertainty had started replacing comfort inside the house. Every unexplained noise, every distant engine, every unfamiliar movement caught my attention. By evening, The camera system was active. By midnight, it had already recorded something. The alert woke me with a soft chime from my phone. Motion detected. Front gate entrance. I sat up instantly and opened the live feed. A dark SUV sat parked just beyond the entrance arch. The headlights were off, but the vehicle remained idling. After nearly 2 minutes, the driver stepped out. Even in low light, I recognized the silhouette. Richard Halverson. He didn't approach the house. He didn't knock or leave paperwork. He simply stood there, hands resting on his hips, slowly scanning the ranch like he was evaluating it, like he was measuring it. After several minutes, he returned to the SUV and drove away. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The visit hadn't been accidental. It hadn't been business either. It had been a message. Claire arrived the next afternoon. She stepped out of her car wearing sunglasses and carrying a leather briefcase, her expression already locked into professional focus. She walked across the porch slowly, studying the house like she was analyzing a crime scene instead of visiting a friend. "You weren't exaggerating," she said as she stepped inside. "This place is beautiful." "My uncle built most of it himself," I said. She nodded, setting her case on the table before pulling out the documents I had sent earlier. "Let's go through everything carefully," she said. For nearly 2 hours, we reviewed records, journal entries, zoning maps, and compliance notices. She marked pages, added notes, and occasionally paused to think through implications before continuing. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. "They're constructing a layered pressure strategy," she said. "Fee demands, compliance citations, implied foreclosure, and now property surveillance. You think him showing up last night counts as surveillance?" "Yes," she said bluntly, "especially if it wasn't announced or documented." I exhaled slowly. "So what's their endgame?" She tapped the map showing the proposed expansion zone. "Your ranch sits directly between 2 parcels they already control," she said. "Without this land, their development plan is fragmented. With it, they can connect infrastructure and dramatically increase property value." The realization hit harder hearing it spoken aloud. "They don't want compliance," I said. "No," she agreed. "They want acquisition." Claire stayed overnight, converting my dining table into a temporary legal command center. Papers spread across every available surface while her laptop glowed under dim lamplight. Around midnight, she looked up from her screen. "There's something else," she said. "What?" "I searched for development permits connected to Spring Valley," she said. "There's a private development company funding most of their expansion." "Which company?" "Westbrook Land Development." The name meant nothing to me. "It should," she said. "They've been involved in multiple aggressive land acquisitions over the last decade. Several complaints, few proven cases." "That sounds comforting," I muttered. She closed her laptop slowly. "Jack," she said, her voice softer now. "If they're involved, this situation might escalate beyond paperwork disputes." "How far?" She met my eyes directly. "Far enough that you need to decide how hard you're willing to fight." The question stayed with me long after she went to bed. I stepped outside onto the porch, the night air cool against my skin. The ranch stretched silently under moonlight, every shadow familiar yet slightly different than it had been days earlier. My uncle's words echoed faintly in memory. "You're responsible for taking care of the land while you're lucky enough to stand on it." I stared across Carter's Edge, feeling the weight of that responsibility settle fully onto my shoulders for the first time. They thought I had inherited property. What I had really inherited was a promise. And promises aren't something you walk away from because someone prints a threatening letter. Inside the house, my phone vibrated softly against the kitchen counter. A new email notification flashed across the screen. Spring Valley Homeowners Association, final notice of noncompliance review. I opened it slowly, already knowing what it would say. "Your continued refusal to address outstanding balance and property violations has triggered formal enforcement evaluation. Representatives will conduct on-site compliance inspections within 7 business days." Claire stepped into the doorway behind me, reading the screen over my shoulder. "They're coming onto the property," she said quietly. "Yes." She crossed her arms, thinking. "They're pushing faster now," she said. "Which means something about their timeline is tightening." I turned toward her. "What kind of timeline?" "Development financing, investor deadlines, zoning approval windows. There are dozens of possibilities," she said. "But pressure like this usually means they're running out of patience." I stared at the message again. 7 days. They thought they were tightening the noose. What they didn't realize was that pressure works both ways. The inspection notice sat on the kitchen table like a countdown clock. 7 days. Claire spent most of the next morning drafting a formal legal response. She moved with the calm precision of someone used to turning chaos into structure. Every sentence she typed sounded controlled, deliberate, and impossible to misinterpret. "They're hoping you'll either panic or ignore them," she said while reviewing the final draft. "This response makes it clear you're doing neither." "What exactly does it say?" I asked. "That their authority over this property is legally disputed, that all enforcement actions must pause pending zoning verification, and that any unauthorized entry will be considered trespassing," she explained. I nodded, feeling a small but noticeable sense of control return. "Send it," I said. She did. The reply came faster than either of us expected. Less than 2 hours later, my email chimed again. "Spring Valley Homeowners Association acknowledges receipt of legal correspondence. Inspection schedule remains unchanged under association compliance authority." Claire stared at the message silently for several seconds. "That's unusually aggressive," she admitted. Meaning they're ignoring legal caution entirely," she said. "Organizations don't usually do that unless they believe they're protected by something larger." "Like what?" She hesitated. "Political backing, development funding, or confidence that intimidation will succeed before legal review finishes." The air inside the house suddenly felt heavier. Over the next several days, the ranch felt less like a sanctuary and more like contested ground. Vehicles began appearing on the main road more frequently. Most passed without stopping, but occasionally one would slow near the entrance arch before continuing. It might have been a coincidence, but coincidence starts to lose meaning when it repeats often enough. I checked the security cameras obsessively, sometimes replaying harmless clips just to reassure myself nothing had been missed. Claire noticed. "You're not sleeping," she said one evening. "I'm fine," I replied automatically. She gave me a look that made it clear she didn't believe me. "Jack," she said gently, "stress makes people careless. You need clarity right now, not exhaustion." I sighed, running a hand across my face. "I just keep thinking about how long they've been planning this," I admitted. "My uncle fought them quietly for years, and I didn't even know it was happening." She leaned against the counter, studying me carefully. "He protected the land the way he knew how," she said. "Now it's your turn." The morning of the inspection arrived under a gray, overcast sky, the kind that made the entire property feel muted and tense before rain. At exactly 9 o'clock, 2 black SUVs turned onto the dirt driveway. Claire and I stood on the porch waiting. The vehicles rolled forward slowly, tires crunching against gravel like distant thunder. When they stopped, 4 people stepped out. Richard Halverson emerged from the first SUV, binder in hand, as always. Beside him stood a woman wearing a crisp business suit and holding a digital tablet. 2 men followed behind them, both dressed in work attire but carrying themselves with the alert posture of security personnel rather than inspectors. Claire stepped slightly forward beside me. "You are not authorized to enter this property," she said calmly. Richard smiled politely, though the expression never reached his eyes. "We are conducting a routine compliance evaluation," he replied. "This property is not under your association's authority," she said. "You were formally notified." "The association disputes that claim," he said smoothly. He stepped toward the porch stairs as if the conversation were already finished. Claire didn't move. "Any further step forward will be documented as trespassing," she said. The tension between them felt like a stretched wire ready to snap. Richard stopped at the base of the steps. He studied Claire briefly, clearly recognizing he was no longer dealing with an uninformed homeowner. "Ms. Reynolds, correct?" he said. "Yes." "I admire your dedication," he said. "However, these matters are larger than individual legal interpretations." "That sentence doesn't mean anything," she replied. His smile widened slightly. "It means development progress rarely stops because of paperwork delays." The 2 security men shifted slightly behind him, their presence becoming more obvious without any words spoken. I stepped forward then, meeting his gaze directly. "You're not coming onto this land," I said. For a moment, silence hung between us while wind rustled through nearby trees. Then Richard closed his binder slowly. "Very well," he said. "We will proceed through alternative enforcement channels." He turned without another word, signaling the others to follow. The SUVs backed down the driveway and disappeared toward the main road. Claire exhaled slowly. That was not normal inspection behavior, she said. No, I agreed. It felt like they were testing boundaries again. She nodded. And they just learned yours. That afternoon, Claire made several calls to colleagues specializing in zoning disputes and development law. I overheard fragments of conversation drifting from the living room. Yes, intimidation tactics. Pending zoning cannot support enforcement. Westbrook involvement increases risk. By evening, she joined me on the porch, her expression thoughtful but concerned. I spoke with 3 separate attorneys, she said. All of them agree on one thing, which is, they're moving unusually fast for a development acquisition, she said, which usually means they're working under external pressure, investors, financing deadlines, or regulatory windows closing soon. I leaned back against the porch railing. So they're desperate. Not desperate, she corrected. Determined. The next escalation came 2 days later. I was repairing a section of fence along the western pasture when I noticed a drone hovering above the property line. It remained stationary, its small rotors buzzing quietly against the open sky. For a moment, I wondered if it belonged to a hobbyist photographer or local surveyor. Then it drifted slowly across the boundary and hovered directly above the barn. I pulled out my phone, recording video while tracking its movement. The drone lingered long enough to capture detailed footage before retreating toward the tree line and disappearing from sight. When I showed Claire, her expression hardened. That is surveillance, she said firmly, and possibly illegal depending on altitude and property rights. They're mapping the land, I said. Yes, she agreed, which means they're still moving forward with development planning. Anger simmered under my skin for the rest of the day. This wasn't subtle anymore. It wasn't administrative pressure or legal maneuvering. It was an intrusion. That night, I sat at the dining table reading through my uncle's journal again, searching for anything I might have missed. Several pages described visits from developers offering money, partnerships, and eventually vague warnings about resistance, creating complications. One entry stood out more than the others. The land agent hinted that if the ranch blocks expansion, association rules might be adjusted. Strange wording. Feels less like business, more like a threat. I closed the journal slowly, the meaning settling deeper now than it had before. They hadn't just been planning expansion. They had been planning leverage. 3 days after the drone incident, Claire received a call that changed the tone of everything. She stepped outside to take it, pacing slowly across the porch while listening. Her posture stiffened halfway through the conversation, and by the time she ended the call, her expression had shifted from concern to focused urgency. What happened? I asked. That was a zoning contact I trust, she said. He confirmed something important. I waited. Spring Valley's expansion proposal is scheduled for final county review in less than 3 weeks, she said. That sounds good for them, I said. It would be, she replied. Except there's a condition. What condition? If your ranch remains outside their control, the expansion fails, she said. The realization hit, like sudden thunder. They need Carter's Edge before the review meeting, I said. Yes. And if they don't get it, they lose investor backing, she said. And possibly the entire development project. I stared across the open pasture, watching wind ripple through tall grass like waves moving across water. For the first time, their urgency made perfect sense. This wasn't about dues. This wasn't about compliance. This was about a deadline. Claire placed her hand on the porch railing beside mine. They're going to escalate again, she said quietly. Organizations under deadline pressure rarely step back. I nodded slowly, already feeling the truth of that statement settle in my chest. The ranch had been peaceful when I arrived, but now it stood at the center of something far larger than inheritance or property rights. It had become a final obstacle in someone else's plan. And obstacles, in business or development, are rarely treated gently. That night, as darkness settled over Carter's Edge, I walked the property alone. The air felt cool and heavy with the scent of approaching rain. Crickets chirped somewhere near the tree line, while distant thunder rolled faintly beyond the hills. I stopped near the barn, resting my hand against the weathered wood my uncle had hammered into place decades earlier. He had fought this quietly, maybe hoping time would outlast pressure. Now the fight had passed to me, and something deep inside told me the next move wouldn't involve paperwork or inspection notices. It would be louder, more direct, and impossible to ignore. The storm arrived just before dawn. Not violent, not destructive, just steady rain falling across the valley in long silver sheets that blurred the hills and softened the edges of everything. The kind of rain that usually made the ranch feel calm, like the land itself was breathing slower. But that morning, calm felt fragile. I was already awake when the first thunder rolled across the mountains. Sleep had been shallow, broken by restless thoughts and half-formed worries that refused to settle. I stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee and watched rain soak into the pasture grass, darkening the soil that had been dry for weeks. Normally, weather like that felt like a blessing. That day, it felt like a pause before something worse. Claire joined me a few minutes later, wrapping her arms against the cold morning air. "You didn't sleep," she said quietly. "Not really." She nodded, like she already expected that answer. "I've been reviewing zoning timelines," she said, "and investor filings tied to the development group." "And?" I asked. "They're running out of time," she said. "Fast." I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the heat settle into my chest. "Which means pressure is about to increase." "Yes," she said simply. The increase came sooner than either of us expected. Around mid-morning, the rain eased into a light drizzle when I noticed a vehicle parked just beyond the entrance arch. It wasn't one of the familiar black SUVs. This one was a white county inspection truck, lights off, but engine running. My stomach tightened immediately. "That's new," I said, pointing toward the driveway entrance. Claire stepped beside me, narrowing her eyes. "That's not HOA," she said. The truck idled for nearly 5 minutes before slowly pulling forward. When it reached the main yard, 2 men stepped out. If anything, the silence that followed felt heavier than the constant pressure that had come before. For the first time since the HOA conflict began, several days passed without notices, inspections, or suspicious vehicles approaching the ranch. That should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like the quiet you get right before a storm hits full force. 3 mornings after the structural certification was finalized, Claire and I were reviewing zoning documentation in the kitchen when my phone buzzed with a notification email. I opened it automatically, expecting another compliance message or county inquiry. It wasn't either. It was a legal filing notice. I stared at the subject line for several seconds before reading it out loud. "Petition for Agricultural Reclassification Review." Claire froze. "Who filed it?" she asked. "Spring Valley Development Consortium," I said. She stood up slowly, already reaching for her laptop. "That's not an HOA action," she said. "That's a full development entity legal maneuver." "What does it mean?" I asked. "It means they're attempting to challenge whether this land qualifies as agricultural property at all," she said. I felt my chest tighten. "They can do that. They can try," she replied. "If they succeed, your land becomes eligible for forced development acquisition through expansion zoning." The word forced hung between us like something toxic in the air. Claire opened the full filing while I paced near the window, reading pieces of the document as she scrolled. "They're arguing the ranch no longer meets minimum agricultural productivity standards," she said. "That's not true," I replied sharply. "I know," she said. "But they're using selective reporting, focusing on recent cattle count reduction and claiming infrastructure instability despite completed repairs." "They're rewriting reality," I said. "They're reframing it," she corrected. "Legally, there's a difference." I stopped pacing, turning toward her. "What's our move?" She hesitated just long enough to tell me the answer wouldn't be simple. "We are preparing for a county zoning hearing," she said. "When?" She scrolled further. 12 days. The hearing became our entire world overnight. Claire contacted agricultural economists, livestock certification agents, and rural land use specialists. Every element of Carter's Edge had to be documented, verified, and defended: grazing productivity, soil sustainability, operational records, infrastructure investment, historical agricultural continuity. I didn't realize how much documentation existed until she started assembling it. Feed receipts from 15 years ago, veterinary logs signed by local ranch vets, satellite grazing rotation maps, photos of seasonal herd movements archived by my uncle. Each piece built a timeline proving the land wasn't just agricultural. It was actively and responsibly maintained as such. The community stepped forward again without hesitation. Tom provided livestock valuation assessments. Linda gathered historical township records showing Carter's Edge listed as agricultural land for over 5 decades. Even neighboring ranchers submitted signed affidavits confirming shared grazing support and seasonal resource cooperation. Watching people rally behind the land hit me harder than I expected. My uncle hadn't just maintained a ranch. He had built trust. But Spring Valley's response escalated just as aggressively. 3 days before the hearing, Claire received a copy of their expert witness filings. Their legal team had hired corporate agricultural consultants prepared to argue that Carter's Edge was economically underperforming and therefore unsuitable for continued agricultural designation. "They're shifting the argument from usage to profitability," she said. "That sounds like business logic, not zoning law," I replied. "It's both," she said. "Development zoning often considers economic optimization. So if they convince the board this land could make more money as housing, they can justify reclassification," she finished. The reality of it made my stomach churn. This wasn't about whether the ranch functioned. It was about whether it generated enough revenue to satisfy development expectations. The night before the hearing, neither of us slept. Claire reviewed documentation repeatedly, highlighting key evidence and preparing counterarguments. I walked the property alone under moonlight, tracing fence lines and pasture edges like I was memorizing every acre in case someone tried to take it away. I stopped near the hill overlooking the entire valley, where my uncle used to stand during sunrise. For a moment, I imagined him there beside me, silent, steady, stubborn as the land itself. "I'm trying," I whispered into the night. The wind carried across the grass like a quiet answer. The county zoning building felt colder than I expected. Rows of wooden benches lined the hearing chamber, filled with residents, ranchers, and development representatives. At the front sat a panel of 5 zoning board members reviewing thick binders of evidence. Spring Valley's legal team occupied the right side of the room, organized, confident, and disturbingly calm. Their lead attorney greeted Claire with a polite nod that felt more like professional rivalry than courtesy. Claire and I sat on the left side, surrounded by community members who had come to support us. The hearing began precisely at 9 o'clock. Spring Valley presented first. Their consultants delivered polished presentations filled with charts, revenue projections, and development models showing potential housing expansion across Carter's Edge. They spoke in calm, analytical tones, carefully avoiding emotional language while emphasizing economic growth and regional housing demand. One consultant summarized their argument clearly. While the Carter property historically served agricultural functions, current operational output falls below optimal sustainability thresholds when compared to projected residential development benefit. Claire leaned slightly toward me and whispered, translation, "They think houses make more money than cattle." When it was our turn, Claire stood with a calm confidence that immediately shifted the energy in the room. She didn't begin with charts. She began with history. "Carter's Edge is not an underperforming agricultural property," she said. "It is a generational working ranch that operates under sustainable land management practices designed for long-term ecological preservation rather than short-term revenue maximization." She introduced documentation proving rotational grazing improved soil health. Veterinary records demonstrated herd sustainability. Financial records showed steady, if modest, agricultural profitability, legally sufficient under zoning preservation statutes. Then she introduced something none of us had discussed beforehand. She displayed a scan page from my uncle's journal. "The Carter family has maintained continuous agricultural stewardship on this land for over 50 years, she said. "Development projections cannot erase established operational reality." I felt my throat tighten unexpectedly. The board questioned both sides for nearly 2 hours. They asked about revenue models, infrastructure longevity, community resource integration, and environmental preservation impacts. Claire answered with calm precision. Spring Valley countered with economic forecasting and housing demand statistics. Finally, one board member turned toward me directly. "Mr. Carter," she said, "why is maintaining agricultural operations on this property important to you personally?" The room went quiet. I hadn't planned to speak emotionally. Claire's strategy focused on documentation and legal evidence. But something about the question pulled words out before I could filter them. "Because land isn't just about output," I said slowly. "It's about responsibility. My uncle didn't run this ranch to maximize profit. He ran it to protect soil, water, and community grazing stability that affects every neighboring property. I paused, steadying my voice. If development replaces every working ranch in this valley, the ecosystem collapses long before anyone notices on a financial spreadsheet. Silence followed. Not dramatic, just heavy and thoughtful. The board recessed for deliberation. Those 40 minutes felt longer than the entire hearing combined. Claire reviewed notes quietly while I sat staring at the floor, listening to muffled conversations echo through the hallway outside. Finally, the board returned. Everyone stood as they resumed their seats. The chairperson adjusted her glasses, reviewing the final decision document before speaking. After reviewing evidence and testimony, she began. The board finds that Carter's Edge meets all statutory requirements for continued agricultural designation. Relief hit like a physical wave. Additionally, she continued, the board recognizes the property's documented environmental and community agricultural contribution as grounds for preservation priority. Spring Valley's attorney remained perfectly composed, though I noticed tension in his jaw. The petition for reclassification is denied. Outside the courthouse, sunlight felt brighter than it had in weeks. Community members shook my hand, congratulated Claire, and slowly dispersed back toward their own ranches and homes. Tom clapped me on the shoulder hard enough to nearly knock me off balance. Your uncle would have been proud, he said. I swallowed hard, nodding silently. Claire stood beside me, finally allowing herself a small, exhausted smile. We won, she said. For now, I replied. She studied me carefully. You're right, she admitted. They're not finished. That evening, back at Carter's Edge, I sat on the porch watching sunset spill gold across the pasture grass. Victory should have felt complete. Instead, something deeper inside warned me this had only blocked one path. Organizations like Spring Valley didn't abandon multi-million-dollar expansion plans because of a single zoning decision. They adapted. They recalculated. They found new leverage. And as darkness settled across the valley, my phone buzzed again. A new email. No subject line. No signature. Just a single sentence inside the message. This land will change ownership eventually. It's only a matter of timing. I stared at the screen while a cold knot formed in my chest. They weren't backing down. They were shifting strategy. And something told me their next move wouldn't involve courts or zoning boards at all. The anonymous message stayed on my screen long after sunset faded into full darkness. This land will change ownership eventually. It's only a matter of timing. No threats. No demands. Just certainty. Somehow, that felt worse. I showed Claire immediately. She read it twice, then placed my phone carefully on the table like it might explode if handled wrong. That's intimidation, she said quietly. Can we trace it? I asked. Probably routed through multiple servers, she replied. People who send messages like this don't usually make mistakes. I leaned back in my chair, staring toward the dark pasture outside the window. So what's left? I asked. Claire didn't answer right away, and that silence told me everything. For nearly 2 weeks, nothing happened. No inspections, no filings, no surveillance drones, no unfamiliar vehicles near the entrance road. Spring Valley had gone completely quiet. The ranch slowly returned to routine. Livestock rotation schedules resumed. Fence repairs finished. Equipment maintenance caught up after weeks of legal distraction. Neighbors stopped by less frequently, reassured that the immediate crisis had passed. From the outside, it looked like victory. But inside, the tension never fully left. It just waited. The final move came on a clear Monday morning. I was checking water lines near the south pasture when Tom's truck roared up the access road faster than I'd ever seen him drive. Gravel sprayed behind his tires as he stopped near the fence line. He jumped out before the engine even shut off. Have you seen the county bulletin yet? He asked, breath slightly rushed. No, I said, instantly uneasy. What bulletin? They posted it this morning, he said. Emergency regional development meeting scheduled for tomorrow. Closed session. My stomach dropped. Closed means? I asked. No public attendance, he said grimly. Usually tied to large-scale infrastructure approval. Claire joined us moments later after hearing Tom's truck. The moment he explained, her expression hardened. They're bypassing zoning, she said. How? I asked. Through infrastructure designation, she replied. If they convince the county that regional housing shortage qualifies as an emergency development priority, they can override individual property resistance through eminent domain review. The words hit like a hammer. They can take the land? I asked. They can try, she said. But eminent domain requires proof of public necessity. Tom crossed his arms, staring toward the hills. They'll argue housing demand equals public necessity, he said quietly. That afternoon became a race against time. Claire contacted every legal connection she had in county administration, trying to gather details about the closed session. Most refused to speak. One finally provided limited information late that evening. They're proposing a regional expansion corridor, she said while pacing the living room. Road extension, utility grid expansion, residential zoning conversion. And Carter's Edge? I asked. She stopped walking. It sits directly in the center of the proposed corridor. The room felt suddenly smaller. We need to challenge the eminent domain justification, Claire said. How? I asked. We prove the land already serves a public benefit strong enough to outweigh development necessity, she replied. I frowned slightly. This is a private ranch. Yes, she said, but not isolated. Think bigger. Agricultural land can qualify as environmental preservation infrastructure if properly documented. Tom's eyes lit slightly. The watershed, he said. Claire turned toward him immediately. Explain. Tom nodded toward the hills. Carter's Edge sits above 3 downstream grazing valleys and 2 municipal water tributaries. If that land gets developed, runoff contamination hits half the county water supply. Claire stared at him. Do we have proof? She asked. Tom smiled slightly. Your uncle made sure we did. For the next 16 hours, the ranch transformed into a war room. Tom contacted neighboring ranchers to gather watershed dependency maps. Linda pulled township environmental protection filings. Claire coordinated with an environmental hydrologist who owed her a professional favor and agreed to produce emergency impact analysis overnight. Meanwhile, I dug through storage boxes in my uncle's office searching for anything related to water preservation. Near midnight, I found it. A locked metal file box buried beneath decades of ranch maintenance records. Inside were soil erosion studies, water table monitoring logs, signed cooperative agreements between ranchers confirming Carter's Edge functioned as primary runoff filtration land for the entire valley basin. My uncle hadn't just protected grazing land. He had protected the county's water system, and he'd never told anyone outside the ranching community. The emergency county session began at 9 the next morning. Closed meeting or not, Claire secured emergency legal entry rights by filing a public environmental protection challenge less than 30 minutes before session start. It forced the board to allow presentation of counter-evidence before final infrastructure approval. We arrived carrying 3 thick binders, 1 digital presentation drive, and about 15 signed affidavits from surrounding ranchers. Spring Valley representatives were already there. Confidence. Prepared. Certain. Until Claire requested speaking priority under environmental preservation statute. The presentation lasted 40 minutes. Claire walked the board through watershed dependency maps showing Carter's Edge acting as natural flood and runoff filtration for nearly 30,000 acres of downstream agricultural and residential land. The hydrologist's report demonstrated how replacing ranch land with housing development would increase chemical runoff, soil destabilization, and water contamination risk affecting municipal supply lines. Then Tom presented historical cooperative grazing agreements proving multi-ranch ecosystem reliance. Finally, Claire presented my uncle's long-term water monitoring logs. Handwritten. 30 years of recorded soil absorption rates and groundwater protection data. The room grew quieter with every page displayed. Spring Valley's lead developer stood when Claire finished. While environmental considerations are valuable, he said calmly, housing demand remains a critical regional necessity. Claire didn't sit down. Environmental collapse is not a housing solution, she replied evenly. It is a long-term infrastructure failure. One zoning board member leaned forward. If this land were preserved, she asked, could its environmental role be formally protected? Claire nodded. Yes. Through agricultural conservation easement designation. The room shifted instantly. Because conservation easements do something powerful. They permanently restrict development rights. The board recessed for emergency deliberation. This time, the weight felt less like fear and more like standing at the edge of something irreversible. Claire sat beside me, exhausted but steady. Tom paced near the hallway window like a caged storm. After nearly an hour, the board returned. The chairperson reviewed several documents before speaking. After reviewing environmental impact evidence, the county finds Carter's Edge constitutes critical watershed preservation land. I felt my hands tighten against my knees. Therefore, the county approves immediate agricultural conservation easement designation upon owner consent. Claire turned toward me slowly. That protects the land permanently, she whispered. No development. Ever. I swallowed hard. And Spring Valley? I asked quietly. They lose the corridor, she said. The chairperson looked directly at me. Mr. Carter, she said, do you consent to conservation easement protection of Carter's Edge? My mind flashed through everything. My uncle walked fence lines. The neighbors showed up with tools and coffee. The cattle grazing peacefully under the open sky. The land breathing quietly beneath generations of responsibility. Yes, I said. The decision ended Spring Valley's expansion plan instantly. Without Carter's Edge, the corridor collapsed. Infrastructure proposals became economically unviable. Investors withdrew within weeks. The HOA stopped sending notices entirely. Their entrance gate sign remained standing at the Valley Road, but it never expanded another inch. Months later, life returned fully to normal. Not quiet, not empty, just steady. Cattle grazed across protected pastures. Seasonal rains flowed clean through filtration valleys. Neighboring ranchers coordinated grazing rotations the way they had for decades. Claire still visited often, though now her briefcase stayed closed more than open. Tom returned to arguing about fence paint colors instead of zoning statutes. Linda resumed organizing township potluck events like nothing dramatic had ever happened. One evening, as sunset rolled across the hills, Claire joined me on the porch watching wind ripple through tall grass. You know, she said softly, most people fight development to keep property value or privacy. I nodded slightly. You fought to protect something bigger, she said. I stared across the valley, watching cattle silhouettes move slowly across golden light. No, I said quietly. I just finished what my uncle started. The land stretched wide and open beneath the fading sky, untouched, protected, and finally safe from anyone who saw it as nothing more than empty space waiting to be filled. Carter's Edge wasn't just inherited anymore. It was defended, and it would stay that way long after I was gone.